Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Sarah. I'm part of Platform, and I'm the project coordinator for Cyber Bytes, a national initiative focused on empowering women and queer youth, especially Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. And like our focus is on digital safety and cybersecurity education. Cybersecurity is all about creating a safer online space, building digital confidence, sharing online tools we can use to protect ourselves and each other. Um, Excited for this presentation and workshop from Alexis. Just a disclaimer before we begin. The workshop will be recorded. Only the presentation portion, participants, video, audio names, anything during the interactive portion will not be included in the final recording. We're committed to creating a safer and respectable space. Any stories, questions, and personal experiences shared during the discussion or breakout rooms will remain confidential and will not be part of the recording and shared outside of this session. If you have any concerns, please feel free to reach out to me in the chat or the facilitator directly, but preferably me. Um, I, uh, and I'm just going to hand it off to Alexis, who will introduce themselves and the workshop.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for joining us. You never know at 3 o'clock what you're going to get on a Monday. There are many other sessions that are happening within the next few days here. So we also have a session on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and Thursday, kind of around this time, and like some at 5 o'clock. So if you're around today and you're also around tomorrow, please do drop in. I'll share some links at the end if folks are interested. My name is Alexis Garota Cochran. I'm a PhD candidate in communication and media and cultural studies at McMaster. I'm the facilitator for today. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm really excited to be able to join Platform and talk a little bit about technology facilitated gender-based violence. It's a mouthful. It's something that I've gotten used to just being like, blah, 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 blah. But just know that if you don't understand what I've said, it's probably just technology facilitated gender-based violence for the 18th time, which will be really fun today and we'll learn a little bit more about. Before we get started, I'm just going to share a link in the chat here. We are gathering all around wherever you might be. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're gathering on Zoom, but I'm based on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So specifically the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Ojibwe peoples. It's home to Métis and also folks who are descendant of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Native Land is a really cool resource. A lot of the team behind Native Land are actually Indigenous, which I think is also really important. You can learn more about the land that you reside on. It's a digital map, but it also functions as somewhat of a living document. So you can learn about territories, languages, treaties of the lands that you reside or the lands that you've settled on. It can be really helpful, I think, to learn a little bit more about the Indigenous communities in your local area, but it's not where you stop. I use Native Land to actually find the Instagram accounts of like really cool community-based organizations that are working within the lands that I reside on. So check it out, learn more about what's locally around you, and support in the ways that you can. And that is a really cool resource to do so. So before we get started here, unsurprisingly, but still necessary, there's going to be a bit of a content warning. All of these topics are in relation to technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which includes but isn't limited to things like online harassment, non-consensual image sharing, cyber stalking, and other forms of digital abuse. These discussions will include some descriptions. We'll go through some case studies and some examples of harmful behavior that participants might find distressing. It also depends on your relationship to technology facilitated gender-based violence. If you've experienced it, if you're someone who's supported someone that's experienced it, it can be distressing and it can be overwhelming. So it's hard to talk about these things. It's hard to research them. I have been in the darkest corners of the internet and I'm not proud of that. But it can be tough. So take your time during the session. If you need to step away, you're welcome to. If you are here and you're like, you know what, I just can't handle this, that's totally cool. Feel free to leave. I'm going to share some resources that come from the Canadian Women's Foundation that go by province if you are based in Canada, and then some national and some international ones as well. But if you need to take a break, take your time. All of these sessions will be available online. Sarah will make them available after the fact. There's some other resources that you can work with. And if you want to chat with me, but you just couldn't deal with today, no judgment. That's totally cool. We will learn in the ways that we can. But feel free to do what feels best for you and your body, mind, and everything that you need. Okay, so a little bit of background on me, which always feels really cringy, but needs to be done. So I'm a PhD candidate in communication studies and media arts at McMaster. I teach courses kind of generally on tech and society and culture. I research digital platforms and how they perpetuate gendered and sexuality-based digital harm specifically. But I'm also really interested in how people kind of like covertly use these platforms to do what they weren't intended, right? So we know that platforms like Meta, or I guess parent companies like Meta, platforms like Facebook and Instagram really love your data. So I really enjoy thinking about how people use those platforms for resistance, acknowledging that platforms are evil and that's just the reality. My research is specifically in technology facilitated gender-based violence. I published the Challenging Gender Digital Harm Research Report that I co-wrote with Rachel Mansell, who is incredible, and then also the Canadian Women's Foundation, which was one of the most we hope is one of the most nationally representative reports of gender digital harm. So it focused on intersectional experiences of Black, Indigenous, women, and gender diverse people of color, as well as those who identify as queer, as disabled, and some youth. But there was some limitations just considering folks being under the age of 18. So we got as much data as we could, and I think it's really helpful. And I'll link it. I'm going to share a ton of resources at the end. So if you hear something that you're like, she has not shared that, and I want to learn more about it, have links for you. I promise they're all coming. And I'll share them after the fact if folks also dip out as well. That's totally okay. I've contributed to a few initiatives to address digital harm as well as gender equity. So I've supported both national and international activities. I was recently at the UN for the Commission on the Status of Women, where we talked all about digital rights and gender equality. I've supported shaping online policy or online harms policy recommendations, as well as regularly support community groups that are interested in advancing digital safety and justice because it can be a really overwhelming space to navigate. So what we'll learn in 50-ish minutes, kind of, sort of, I've entitled this session Understanding and Responding to Technology Facilitated Gender-Based Violence. So that's what we're going to aim to do in the next hour. We're going to define technology facilitated gender-based violence and connect it to systems of oppression like racism, ableism, anti-Indigeneity, as well as other forms of discrimination. We'll go through real-world examples so we can start to understand how things like power and privilege shape our digital experiences. And then we'll go through some resources, we'll identify some strategies for things like support or advocacy or prevention. And we will try to go through all of that in 50 minutes. And there's a good amount of takeaway things that I'll provide as well. So folks are interested in learning more, or maybe there's something that you're like, she's only talked for 2 minutes and I want 20. We have lots of resources for you too here. So I thought we would start off just if folks could respond in the chat, kind of let me know what they're feeling. What would a safe digital space look or feel like to you? If folks want to respond in the chat, sometimes folks want to unmute, but I know that can be scary, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would a safe digital space look or feel like to you? Also a sneaky way to get a drink in. Okay, maybe I will start us off. So my initial thoughts are I would love to be able to share things without worrying what people might think about them. You know, like I would love to be able to share my perspectives without fearing how people might interpret them. I see that folks in the chat are saying where personal info is respected and honored, being able to express yourself in a respectful way. That's awesome. For any folks who are hesitant to share, I will read these without your name, so they won't be included in the transcript or in the recordings. But I love that, and I agree with both of these answers. I think being able to like actually be who you want to be and not worrying about how other perceptions or potential harms might come onto you, I think that's excellent. Where blocking accounts and words actually worked. This is a radical idea and doesn't often happen. Absolutely. Customizable privacy settings, yes. And then also, I think on top of that, privacy settings that actually work, privacy settings that actually make you feel safe from platform harms as well, because we also know that platforms just like scoop up our data and do whatever they want with them. Knowing that my information or my imagery won't be used somewhere else or plugged into AI or used for surveillance, absolutely. I think about this a lot. I have a bunch of friends that are visual artists. and they have Instagram accounts where they share all of their art, but I think there's initial hesitation because you never know where that goes once it's like in the digital sphere or you don't know how people are using it. Yep, free from vocal reactionary accounts, a space where the potential for harm is recognized and acknowledged. Like me, yes. That's what this space is all about today, as well as giving a choice to set up your profile without the default settings. Yeah, or like maybe a walkthrough of what decisions mean or how certain decisions might impact you in the long run. I think a lot of platforms benefit from us not understanding the privacy settings. But then as a result, we don't understand or we're not conscious of the ways in which sometimes those privacy settings don't keep us safe or they put us in harm's way. And then being able to talk about issues that matter without right-wing censorship, also a very radical idea. We are in the right place. Okay, perfect. Everyone has found the right workshop. We will talk about many of these things today. Thank you all so much for participating. Whenever you throw out a question in the dark, or it's not dark, it's like 3 o'clock. But whenever you ask a question, you're like, I don't know if folks will participate, but this was excellent. Knowing that platforms don't fund genocides. Absolutely. Yes. We will talk about all of these things today. And then we'll go through some definitions of technology facilitated gender-based violence. And specifically, we're going to think about privilege and power and how that kind of plays out on platforms. So we are all in the right place. Thank you so much. And if you have differing opinions, you are welcome here too. But that was really wonderful. And I'm appreciative of everyone who has participated. Okay. So we have a chart here. So technology facilitated gender-based violence definitions, I would say, vary across various disciplines and sectors. TFGBV is also called things like cyber violence or online or digital violence. The Canadian Women's Foundation's project was called Gender Digital Harm. It all means similar things. So I would say there are a variety of definitions and of terms that are used to describe similar things. However, I would say technology facilitated gender-based violence. Online violence, anything that has gender dimensions, are generally understood as the use of technology for harm or harassment or abuse based on either gender, gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender. And like these definitions are actually quite important, particularly because technology facilitated gender-based violence is rooted in frameworks of gender-based violence, which evolved from violence against women or VAW. So there are still going to be some conversations about digital harm that frame digital harm as digital harm against women, particularly because violence against women was such a popularized term. I would like to clarify here for the purpose of this session, I think for the purpose of a lot of the work that Platform is doing, that when we say gender, we don't mean just women, because it's not just women, it's patriarchal structures, which we'll talk quite a bit about today. Um, if someone who works in gender-based violence service or prevention, I see some familiar names in the chat that I know work within like sexual violence prevention, which is super exciting. You're probably familiar with this terminology shift from violence against women to gender-based violence. But for folks who aren't as familiar, initially this term of violence against women was employed in activism spaces and legal frameworks, in policy to describe forms of violence or abuse that were rooted in patriarchal structures, right? However, women who or people who identify as women are not the only folks that are impacted by patriarchal structures. So the use of violence against women was critiqued for being present or presenting this kind of cis-normative, heteronormative perspective that excluded trans, non-binary, two-spirit, gender diverse folks that also experience patriarchal harm. So gender-based violence was then incorporated as a term to acknowledge that these forms of patriarchal violence are not only on a basis of gender. And often it wasn't even thinking about gender, it was thinking more about sex within like a binary perspective. But the way that we're going to be thinking about it today will also be thinking about gender norms and identities and expressions. So returning back to our definition of TFGBV, which is on the screen here at the top, this includes digital harm on a basis of gender. Many of these definitions for context come from Women and Gender Equality Canada. Some of them can be improved. However, they are, I would say, widely understood within the Canadian context as these core definitions here. So gender refers to the roles or the behaviors or the expressions or identities that society has associated with particular genders, right? So these are norms that are cultural but also societal, and they adapt and they change over time. So as Wage notes, gender equality or gender particularly greatly impacts the distribution of power, particularly thinking about gender inequalities. As well as resources in society and people's social or health or economic outcomes. Gender identity, on the other hand, while gender is defined by social norms, by social roles and social expectations, gender identity is defined by the self, right? By what you feel internally. So, Wage defines this as the internal and deeply felt sense of being a man, a woman, both, or neither, or something in between, or something nowhere near, or something on a spectrum that is not even kind of close to this, right? So, this may align with someone's sex or how they were assigned at birth, particularly, but it also may differ. And that's something that can still be influenced by TFGBV and something that can be targeted by TFGBV. Gender expression refers to the various ways that people choose to express their gender identity. So that can be clothes, that could be voice or hair or makeup. And a person's gender expression might not align with societal expectations of gender. So, particularly thinking about this, you might have someone who identifies as a woman who prefers to dress more masc or more masculine. You might have someone who identifies as non-binary but prefers to dress more femme or feminine. This doesn't dictate their gender or their gender identity, but you can still be targeted based on how you present your gender expression. And then perceived gender, which I think is the worst one when it comes to thinking about. I mean, there are various horrible ways to experience technology facilitated gender-based violence, but I think often when we think about perceived gender, we think about what others assume of someone's gender, regardless of how they identify, which removes their own agency and consent. And this is often how someone perceives you. So, for example, if someone is misgendering you because they perceive you as a certain gender, regardless of how you identify, that's what we mean by perceived gender. And of course, like misgendering is not something that we do. But this is the perception, particularly thinking about how TFGBV might intersect with perceived gender. So we go through all of these. We will have access to a recording. So we'll go through all of these, particularly because TFGBV is not violence against women. Women can be impacted by TFGBV, absolutely. But instead, it's more the use of technology to perpetuate against those who either their gender or their gender identity or their gender expression challenges or deviates from normative gender like understandings, norms, perceptions, expectations. So, an example of this would be women and girls, of course, are frequently targeted, particularly within things that are misogynistic or patriarchal contexts, but it also impacts transgender folks, particularly trans women, trans men, non-binary folks, who are often targeted for expressing gender identities that are outside of these dominant norms. Non-binary, two-spirit, we see queer gender and gender diverse people impacted because their identities tend to challenge these binary systems. And as a result, they're often subject to things like erasure or harassment or targeting online. To us LGBTQIA communities or queer communities, as a queer person, I tend to use that pretty interchangeably. But just know when I say queer, I mean to us LGBTQIA because, like TFGBV, that is a very long acronym. But I also respect that some folks prefer to us LGBTQIA plus. They are particularly these expressions of gender or sexuality that fall outside of dominant or heteronormative expectations and cultures are also targeted by TFGBV. And then you have men and boys as well, right? Whether or not they're folks who identify as queer, they can also be targeted by these kind of toxic normative masculinities. So queer men, of course, but also men who maybe express vulnerability, or even men who support gender justice, anything that moves out of this kind of like toxic macho masculinity can also be targeted for TFGBV because, again, going off of this definition, it deviates from gender norms, roles, or expectations. And one thing to maybe clarify is this is not an exhaustive list, but people who are perceived to belong to a particular gender, for example, or they're often impacted by TFGBV, even if they don't identify that way. So someone can be harassed because they're assumed to be a woman or they're assumed to be queer, which is also something that we'll think a little bit more about today. Okie dokie. So we're going to go through, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have said okie dokie out loud. Anyway, okay. We're going to go through TFGBV. It's complex. There's various kinds of of harm that overlap each other. They reinforce each other. So we're going to go through some examples, some definitions, and then some really short kind of just examples of how this might come up in everyday life. And then we'll go through some case studies as well to kind of familiarize ourselves a little bit. So, online harassment refers to harming someone by sending threats or insults or abusive messages. Sometimes this can look like, for example, a woman's ex-partner might repeatedly text or DM her abusive messages, and the partner might also create multiple fake accounts when they're blocked. And I think someone in the chat here initially, when we said, what would a safe space look and feel like? Someone's response was, when you block people, they actually stay blocked. That's a really good example of how online harassment continues to pop up. This might look like, and many of these examples have actually happened. This might look like a Muslim woman journalist who maybe publishes something on gender-based violence and receives hundreds of Islamophobic or misogynistic tweets. Sometimes this is called dogpiling, particularly when multiple people perform the same type of abuse on online spaces, particularly spaces like Twitter or X. Unfortunately, X now. People will target the same person or the same tweet to try to either get their account removed or to try to get the content removed. And it's often this kind of collaborative form of harm. And then another example would be if a trans man receives daily misgendering or anti-trans memes via Twitter or Instagram or whichever platform after speaking out, let's say on a podcast for healthcare discrimination. Another example would be doxing. So doxing refers to revealing or publishing private information or identifying information without consent to either intimidate or to harass or to cause harm, including to someone's credibility or their reputation. So this might look like a trans rights advocate that has their address and their employer shared on Reddit after maybe speaking at City Hall about local anti-trans policies, but it also might look like a Black woman professor who has trolls flood her inbox, or maybe have people reach out to their employer and directly say, like, you should remove this person because she's supporting equity-based curriculum reforms. We'll actually go through an example that had a really similar experience, and it's often people that are dogpiling, again, like doing the same kind of form of harm multiple times in order to try to remove people from particular experiences or opportunities. It has a pretty high financial implication as well, and we'll look at some examples of that shortly. Non-consensual distribution of intimate images is another one that's like blah, blah, blah. But it's often called NCDII. So it's the sharing or threatening to share sexual or intimate either photos or videos without someone's consent. People are probably most familiar with this one within the context of revenge porn. So if someone has intimate images maybe taken by a former partner that's leaked to a group chat, maybe it's done in a reactionary way, particularly if someone has broken up with another person and they threaten to share their intimate images to like particularly get back at them. That's what this kind of this harm looks like. But this particularly non-consensual distribution of intimate images significantly overlaps with deepfakes. So for folks who are unfamiliar, and I imagine, and we'll talk a little bit about Taylor Swift later, because I feel like now when we talk about deepfakes, like that's the first core example that we think of. But deepfakes are digitally manipulated media that uses artificial intelligence to replicate someone's likeness. So deepfakes can be used to spread misinformation. They can be used to create fake or like false sexual content. But often when deepfakes are created, they are sexual or defamatory in nature. There's two different kinds of deepfakes. Deepfakes, particularly, are hyper realistic fakes that use artificial intelligence. So, an example of this would be yes, in Denmark, citizens can now copyright their faces, absolutely, which was really excellent when thinking about deepfakes and non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So an example of a deepfake would be if a Black woman influencer or anyone, right? Like someone who has a bunch of photos online. This is something that often impacts influencers. This often impacts celebrities. We see this happen a lot with politicians as well. Really anyone that has a lot of content online that can easily be manipulated. So if a influencer discovers that her face has been grafted onto a pornographic video using deepfake technology, that's an example of a deepfake, whereas a shallow fake tends to use simpler editing strategies, so things like cropping or falsely labeling or dubbing over original audios. An example of this would be if a WOC politician or a woman of color politician is falsely subtitled in an interview to make it appear like she's saying something that she's not. Within this example, it was that she was saying something racist, particularly as a coordinated disinformation campaign to try and challenge her credibility, try to make her look like she's saying something that she's not, and essentially trying to harm her overall through whether it is in relation to her career or in relation to her stance or whatever it may be. Online surveillance and stalking is one that I think is probably very common for folks at this point, particularly using digital tools to monitor or track someone's activities or their movements or their communications, whether that's off or online, particularly without their consent. Given some of the responses that folks had included previously, I would invite you to have a critical think about whether or not platforms are also engaging in forms of online surveillance and stalking without our consents. They are. But that's something that I think we can also think about given some of the responses that we've seen. So an example of this could be a woman who's maybe tracked using location data from a fitness app, from an abusive partner, maybe something that she forgot was connected, particularly because it is without their consent, as well as a Black woman who's living in a gentrifying neighborhood that's harassed by neighbors, and potentially using something like a Ring doorbell footage. For folks who are unfamiliar, it's like those webcam-looking doorbells to monitor her movements and report suspicious behavior to police. And as we know, particularly within a gentrifying neighborhood, it's probably not suspicious movement. It's probably just a Black woman moving around. But what do I know? The last example that we'll go through today is thinking about impersonation and anonymous harassment. So this is creating fake online profiles to impersonate others or to conceal one's identity with the intention to either harass or to deceive or to harm someone. So this might be, for example, a sex worker might find multiple fake profiles that claim to be her, advertise services that she doesn't offer, and it posts explicit images that were stolen from her private accounts, which also overlaps with non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is initially when we first started this section. We talked about how many of these things overlap. This is a really core example, but it could also look like a transgender activist that's maybe targeted by anonymous accounts that attempt to impersonate her, posting offensive content with the intention to damage her reputation and to confuse her followers. So, impersonation and online harassment can also sometimes have financial implications. An example that I could think of, particularly with many elderly folks, is they are often they experience scams on the phone. They're not able to tell, for example, that someone is actually who they say they are, and as a result, sometimes are convinced to have to pay certain amounts of money. My grandparents fell victim to one of these schemes. They didn't realize that they weren't actually calling about their pension and it wasn't Justin Trudeau, which was fascinating, and that's okay. But I think a lot of these really difficult technologies now, especially with AI, make it really hard for people to tell whether or not someone is actually who they say they are. So this kind of impersonation, anonymous harassment, is also a core example of how sometimes these things are enacted. So TFGBV can happen across many different platforms. On social media, I think this is like often where we see it the most. So platforms like X, or again, unfortunately X now, as well as Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. We see it used for mass harassment campaigns, again, or dogpiling. We see impersonation, we see deepfake distribution, but we also see trolling. But it can also happen within private or semi-private spaces for harassment, for harmful messages, and for deceiving others. So messaging apps like WhatsApp, especially WhatsApp. I find there's like a lot of WhatsApp scams now. Telegram, Signal, Discord, Snapchat, platforms like this. Dating apps can also facilitate things like stalking or doxing or gendered and racialized harassment. So your Bumble, your Tinder, your Grindr, your Hinge. And gaming platforms as well, particularly because these spaces are often associated with harassment, with hate speech, and with sexist or racist slurs and other remarks. They're often normalized. I would say particularly more like your Xbox Live opposed to like maybe your stream or your Discord, but it can also happen within these spaces as well. Deepfake generators are getting significantly better and significantly easier to come across, so they can be used to create sexually explicit or violent content, particularly often targeting women, women of color, as well as trans folks and other folks, and surveillance tools more broadly. So sometimes you'll hear in the news that people are getting air tagged, where someone will like put an air tag tracking device in like a car or a bag that someone is unaware of to either digitally stalk them if it's within an online context, to control their movements, or to monitor their activities. So a few examples that we'll go through. I know I've mentioned Taylor Swift. I think this is just like the core example of deepfakes, and I think it's really helpful to conceptualize. So for folks who are unfamiliar, in January of 2024, we saw pornographic deepfake images of Taylor Swift shared on Twitter and on 4chan. One of these posts was seen over 47 million times before it was removed 17 hours later. 17 hours later is an interesting component because, like, you might say, like, it took 17 hours for someone as famous as Taylor Swift, but then 17 hours also doesn't feel fast enough in some perspectives. So I think that's something interesting to think about. So due to this being such a high profile example of deepfakes, it also promoted responses from advocacy groups, from politicians, from the tech sector, all essentially discussing the consequences of deepfakes. So at the time, Twitter claimed that they would suspend accounts that were sharing the image. But the deepfakes continued to be reshared, and they also spread over to other platforms like Instagram and Reddit. So there was a large critique on how Twitter responded, particularly because it didn't feel like it was prepared to do so, or folks didn't feel like Twitter had done enough at the time, which I agree with. But Twitter also potentially blocked or briefly blocked searches of Taylor Swift's name for a short period of time with an attempt to negate the spread. But of course, when it extended to other platforms, there was not really much that blocking someone's name could do. So research has found, particularly the research that comes from Henry and Witt, found that women identifying celebrities are frequent targets of deepfakes due to their public visibility, but also the vast number of images that are available online for manipulation. Research also found that 98% of deepfakes are pornographic, and most of the time they're created without the knowledge or consent of the featured person. The interesting thing about the conversation in relation to Taylor Swift's experience was it really pushed people to start thinking about AI harms, especially deepfake legislation. So the popularization of deepfakes prompted legal response. An example would be the US's new Take It Down Act, which was signed into law May 19th, 2025, so just earlier this year, which criminalizes the non-consensual online publication of intimate visual depictions. So this is both actual photos of yourself, so like actual photos of you, but then also deep fakes that are intimate or pornographic in nature. And it included both adults as well as minors. When it was shared without consent and for the intent to harm, to harass, or to arouse. One thing that's interesting about this component, this comes directly from resources out of the US. Minors can't consent to things like this, so it's just interesting that the sentence was framed in this way. But of course, minors or anyone under the age of 18 or the age of majority cannot consent. So it doesn't matter if it was intended for harm because it's pornographic either way and it's child porn either way. So individuals who knowingly either threaten or share non-consensual intimate imagery or NCII, which includes deepfakes, in the US can face federal charges. So there's potential for prison time, for fines, as well as for restitution, and penalties may be harsher. This is also from like the from US resources. Penalties may be harsher for cases involving minors, and of course they should be. Um, so this would do a few interesting things. It would place responsibility on platforms to implement what they call a notice and removal procedure to remove content within a specific period of time. So within the US, it's 48 hours after receiving a valid report. And they also have to make reasonable efforts to attempt to either delete duplicates of the same content as well as reposts. And I think this sounds great in theory, but there are also potential harms that can be associated with this legal response. It could result in false or malicious takedowns, or like takedown requests. For example, whether it be ex-partners or trolls that are falsely reporting content as a form of targeted dogpiling. Within 48 hours, there's also no required independent review before removing. So this means that legitimate content could actually be targeted faster and without much review. This could be especially detrimental for sex workers, for trans content creators, for marginalized creators more broadly, who we already know are likely to be censored, to be flagged, to be targeted. Proof of harm within this perspective of like a proof of harm to either intent or harass is also incredibly difficult to prove within AI contexts. And often when people report, whether it be AI harms or non-consensual distribution of intimate images, or anything that has to do with technology facilitated gender-based violence more broadly, there's often a culture of disbelief. So this is actually something that could potentially replicate that. For folks who I'm Canadian, platform is Canadian. However, so folks might be wondering, like, thinking about the American context is actually important, particularly because a lot of these platforms fall under US jurisdiction. So this means that these laws, despite the fact that they're enacted in the US, could actually impact the way that we all use platforms because it places particular duties on these platforms. There are comparable international attempts at doing something similar to what the Online Safety Act would do, or sorry, the Take It Down Act would do. So the UK has the Online Safety Act, Australia has Enhancing Online Safety, New Zealand has Harmful Digital Communications, and South Korea has the Digital Sex Crimes Act. In comparison, Canada is actually quite delayed when it comes to online harms responses. So at this point, Canada doesn't require that online platforms remove any non-consensual intimate images within a specific time frame, and survivors often have to go through various channels, so police, as well as the courts, and individual platforms as well, which can be slow, which can be inconsistent, which can be re-traumatizing, but also can be potentially biased as well, right? Because there's no consistent way that these issues are being dealt with. Canada also currently lacks deepfake specific responses at this stage, while non-consensual intimate images are criminalized under the Section 162.1 of the Criminal Code. It doesn't actually cover platform responsibility, it doesn't cover repeat posting, and it doesn't cover AI content yet. And this also hasn't been updated since 2015. Folks may be familiar with the Online Harms Act, which was often referred to as Bill C-63, which was introduced in February of 2024. So it was intended to do a lot of the things that I'm critiquing right now, and I think a lot of the things that we were critiquing in the chat earlier. So it was meant to regulate harmful online content, which included non-consensual intimate imagery and deepfakes, as well as establish a Canadian Digital Safety Commission. However, the bill was unable to advance, particularly as a result of the proroguing parliament that we recently saw. It's said that currently Liberals are in the process of looking at new online harms responses, but currently, as of right now, we do lack adequate AI responses. The next example that I'm going to go through is going to mention gun violence quickly. If folks are unable to be here for that, that's totally okay. I would recommend muting and coming back at like maybe 3:45. But with that acknowledgement, I will really quickly shift over. It is to talk about the case with Megan Thee Stallion. For folks who are unfamiliar with this, Megan Thee Stallion received vicious online backlash after publicly accusing Tory Lanez of shooting her. He was later found guilty of just that, of assault with, of illegal possession of, and negligent discharge of a firearm. This is all we will say about this, and then we will move on. But what I think is the most interesting thing to think about and the most problematic when talking about online harms is Megan Thee Stallion was subject to daily death threats, to sexual assault threats, to disinformation campaigns that aimed to target her credibility, as well as victim blaming, memes, and content that mocked her assault. Megan's experience also highlights how survivors of digital hate often have, like we just discussed, their credibility questioned. They're not often believed, and they're subject to digital forms of hate that have both physical and psychological consequences. This is a really core example of what Moya Bailey coins misogynoir, which is specifically the hatred, the dislike, the distrust, and the prejudice directed towards Black women. So it's a unique compound of the violence that's experienced by Black women, as well as Black femmes, Black non-binary folks, Black gender diverse people, grounded in both racial as well as gender-based oppression. So Megan Thee Stallion experienced online harassment that exemplifies how misogynoir has resulted in having her integrity questioned. She was mocked, she was doubted after sharing her assaults, which reflects how Black women are often not believed, especially when it comes to explicitly naming the harms that they're experiencing. I think after experiencing such significant trauma, we saw Megan Thee Stallion forced to defend herself, right? And to also convince others that what she experienced was actually valid, which highlights this key problematic of online harm, particularly because many fans of Tory Lanez continued to harass her as she was telling her truth, which we after saw was truthful. Of course, like innocent until proven guilty, but like, no, Tory Lanez is trash. Okay, keeping an eye on time here, I was going to share a video, but I think I'm going to pause and share it after the fact. Again, there are resources, so I'll share a little bit of context here. For folks who might not be familiar, I think this is a really good example of a targeted harassment campaign. So Rachel Gilmore is a Ottawa-based Canadian journalist. She focuses on human rights, on disinformation, on political extremism. Particularly now, she's focusing a lot more on like far right and alt-right activity in Canada. She gained a lot of popularity for covering the Freedom Convoy, particularly and for folks who aren't unfamiliar with the Freedom Convoy, it attracted far-right groups, white nationalists, conspiracy theorists that were kind of a part of this larger anti-government demonstration. I bring this up because in April of 2025, Rachel Gilmore was scheduled to offer a Fact Check Friday segment on CTV's Your Morning, which was a segment that was intended to like address and debunk false claims surrounding the federal election. It was meant to be a weekly installment, but it only happened once before it was canceled. Gilmore and CTV were hit with like a massive harassment campaign that was led by trolls that regularly follow Gilmore. A lot of Gilmore's work, a lot of Gilmore's journalism, and a lot of her other activities. She's been very public about the harassment that she's experienced, which even included Reddit users posting her location as they see her publicly and encouraging physical harassment. I think this is a good example of how TFGBV has financial implications. It impacts people's credibility, their ability to work, but it also has real world consequences. In the video I was going to share, which I'll pause on for now because I know we're coming up at about four-ish, um, Rachel Gilmore was very open about sharing the fact that people will come up to her in the street and scream at her, and people will see her on the street and then take photos and share them to alt-right social media accounts and encourage people to go up to her and find her. And it's resulted in a lot of fear that has both, I think, physical implications, particularly because she is at risk, but also psychological as well, right? And results in people, and Megan Thee Stallion shared similar experiences of being scared to go outside. So I think that TFGBV, while it's often understood to be online harms, does have very real consequences. So I think these examples tell us a few things. There's a lack in platform accountability for one, such as either the slow or the inadequate platform responses to digital harms, even when people, those that are experiencing them, are really high profile, someone like Taylor Swift with however many billion followers. And I think this also means that everyday survivors are even less adequately protected. You know, if we're critiquing the fact that it took so long for a deepfake of Taylor Swift to come down when it took 17 hours, while I agree with that statement and it shouldn't have existed, period, someone who doesn't have that massive of a following probably won't have that same quick response, right? I think it also reminds us that online harms continue to advance as new technologies continue to advance. You can really easily access chatbots. You can really easily develop AI imagery now with like literally the simple search key of an enter button. So the easier that it is to be able to do these things, I think the more that legislation needs to keep up. And an example of this is Canada lacking this adequate AI harms response. I think these examples also show how gendered abuse intersects with things like race and politics. So, an example of Megan Thee Stallion facing both gendered disinformation, but also racialized harassment rooted in misogynoir, but also something like someone like Rachel Gilmore being harassed for covering political events like the convoy, silencing her and removing her from the public sphere. So, I bring all of these things up to kind of bring this point home that TFGBV is never going to be experienced equally, right? We see TFGBV disproportionately impacting cis and trans women, trans men, non-binary, two-spirit, and other and gender diverse folks more broadly, particularly those who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or people with disabilities and those at the intersection. So coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, I think this intersectional framework that looks at the multiple systems of oppression and how they intersect to impact people's experiences is especially important when we're thinking about technology facilitated gender-based violence and digital harms more broadly, because it's not possible to only think about gender, particularly when someone is also racialized, because those experiences, as we've seen with Megan Thee Stallion, impact each other and compound each other. So while TFGBV is rooted within gender-based oppression, it also intersects other forms of oppression. So things like racism, ableism, transphobia, colonialism, and again, they compound each other, especially within online contexts. And so within the context of TFGBV, this means that people experience online harms differently. We might think about this as differential vulnerabilities, or the ways that some people are more frequently targeted, but also more harshly impacted, less likely to be protected, supported, believed due to their intersecting identities as well as their social positions. So a few examples of this is, you know, we see sexism take place when women and trans and non-binary people are disproportionately targeted by sexualized violence, as well as things like threats and attempts to silence them. For racialized people, especially Black women and gender diverse people, this harm exists at the intersection of both race and gender, like the examples of misogynoir that we've discussed. Disabled people or people with disabilities, both of those terms function differently to different people. They may be surveilled, they may be infantilized, they may be dismissed online, but they often also lack adequate reporting and support options, which in itself is a form of digital ableism. Trans people are often the targets of transphobic misgendering, things like outing, hate speech, and platforms often fail to protect them. And then Indigenous women, gender diverse people, and two-spirit folks often face erasure, hate speech, and data exploitation in ways that are tied to settler colonial histories and ways of knowing. Um, so Sarah, how am I on time? Are we stopping at 4?
We can go over if you like need the time.
Perfect. We'll say 4:15. We'll say 4:15 and people can keep me honest. Okay.
um
Um, hmm, perfect.
I'll be sharing a link at the end for an honorarium for the workshop. So if you could just stay for that at the end.
You got
Thank
it. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, perfect. Okay, so digital harm is prevalent. We're going to go through some statistics to really kind of drive some of these points home. So in 2025, the United Nations Population Fund found that almost 2 in 3 women globally had been subjected to TFGBV. Globally, we also saw 85% of women that witnessed online violence being committed against another woman. Within the context of the Canadian Women's Foundation, which was some of the research that I supported, we saw that in Canada, 61% of women and gender diverse people had experienced some form of gendered digital harm. And the YWCA found that across Canada, 1 in 4 young women and gender diverse youth were personally attacked by online violence. This is especially prevalent for marginalized groups. The YWCA found that 70% of people with disabilities were likely to experience digital harm. For queer people or 2S LGBTQ folks, this was 59%. It was also 59 for Indigenous folks, and for Black folks, it was 53. I will say I feel like that statistic feels low, particularly thinking about some of the research that was done with the Canadian Women's Foundation or CWF, but these are the statistics that we have now. Particularly some common types of online harm included things like sexist or misogynistic harm, harm based on body types or physical characteristics, as well as racism and homophobic or transphobic harm. Within the context of the Canadian Women's Foundation, we found that Black, Indigenous, racialized, 2S LGBTQIA, as well as youth that were 18 to 25, and people with disabilities were most frequently targeted by online harm. Indigenous women and gender diverse people identified their Indigenous identity as the top reason that they were targeted for online harm. For Black women, this was linked to their race, their gender, and their skin tone. For women and gender diverse people that had disabilities, they were twice as likely to have misinformation shared about them. And there's more. This is also something that I've included in the links as well if folks are interested in reading any of these reports fully. The last statistics come from Plan International's Free to Be Online question mark. Girls and young women's experiences of online harassment. It was a research report, so this was a global project that aimed to understand online harassment worldwide. They saw that more than half of the 14,000 girls from around the world that they surveyed reported either experiencing harassment or abuse online. 1 in 4 girls felt that being abused online made her feel physically unsafe. As results, we saw that 37% of girls who identified themselves as an ethnic minority were also harassed based on their identity. This was 42% for 2S LGBTQ folks. And online harassment starts for girls as early as age 8, and majority of girls had already been harassed by the time they were 14 to 16. So all of this to say is, there's a few key takeaways that I think are really important here. So TFGBV is structural, right? It's not individual bad actors, but it's rooted in larger systems of power like sexism, racism, ableism, and platform design that makes some people more vulnerable to harm than others. TFGBV can involve harm directed at individuals, but it also contributes to systemic discriminatory harms against marginalized people. So within the case of gender-based violence, this can refer to either cis or trans women, non-binary, two-spirit, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, agender, intersex folks as well. But it can also refer to people who are perceived as a particular gender, regardless of how they identify, as well as folks that identify with non-normative gender expression, all of which place people at risk for gender-based violence and, as a result, technology-facilitated gender-based violence as well. As we've talked about today, not everyone experiences TFGBV the same. People have faced different levels of risk and harm depending on things like their race, their gender identity, and other identifiers like disability or class or more. It also shows how power and inequity shape who's most exposed as well as least protected to forms of digital harm. I have a personal beef with the response that just logging off is like an accurate solution. So this is often the first thing that we hear when we report online harm. People will say like, "Oh, just log off," or like, "Why did you continue to engage?" But I think that suggesting that the response should be just to log off ignores how essential digital spaces are for things like expression, connection, activism. Logging off can mean losing things like community to folks, or visibility, or information, or access to democratic participation, and really challenges free speech, particularly within digital ways. I guess one of the other things to think about is online harm is a real form of harm. When reporting online harm to police, survivors have reported being told that not much can be done until something real happens or until something physical happens. Even though it happens through a screen, TFGBV can have serious mental, emotional, and physical consequences. It can affect people's sense of safety, of dignity, and of well-being, both offline and online. And in the case of someone like Rachel Gilmore, it can result in real online or offline scenarios. So people trying to find her whereabouts or encouraging others on message boards to like go up to her physically. We often see that online hate will translate into offline forms of violence. So it's not something that should be kind of scoffed at until something real happens, because it is a real form of harm and it can adapt to other forms of harm that are more physical. I think the last thing to think about is that solutions need to be flexible and context aware. Particularly, I think we often hear solutions like identity verification that might be helpful, but they can also create new forms of risk, particularly for trans folks, for undocumented folks, for sex workers, or for survivors who rely on things like anonymity to be online in safe ways. Um, so I think to end off or to think a little bit about technology facilitated gender-based violence is, of course, a structural issue. This is what we've talked about the entire time. It's deeply rooted in systems of oppression. So individual actions can't challenge them, right? Like if you use a two-factor authentication, it's not going to change the fact that technology facilitated gender-based violence still happens. No individual action can fully eliminate the risks because of course they are structural, but these practical steps can really support you in thinking more about your online safety and your well-being. So some things that I think I recommend right off the bat is identifying potential online risks that you face and accounts that might feel particularly unsafe. For instance, I think if you're a activist on Instagram and you regularly receive really harmful DMs, right, or really harmful comments, then you might understand that for you, that platform is not safe, right? There might be safety mechanisms in place. You might be doing the best that you can, but you understand that you have a particularly harmful community within this one platform. So you might recognize this and think about, how do I tighten my privacy settings, right? How do I limit who can comment or message me? How can I use tools to potentially filter out harmful language? And it's not just about the fact that people are saying harmful things. It's about the impact that it has on you, whether that be your safety, whether that be your emotional safety, how you feel, whatever you can do to still be able to participate in digital spaces, I think is important, because the solution is not to log off. Everyone is entitled to be able to share their experiences, particularly when they're in relation to their identity, and especially when they're folks that are marginalized and often removed from digital spaces. I think other recommendations that tend to be helpful, and I have a little bit more of an extensive list at the end here. So you can secure your accounts, stronger passwords can be helpful, two-factor authentication, limiting what personal information you share publicly, I think is really important. This is something that if folks go on and watch the Rachel Gilmore video after the fact, she talks about this very publicly. When she invites friends over and they take photos in her apartment, she asks people to make sure that they can't actually see any of the what's outside of her windows, because people would be able to identify where she lives. So thinking about the information that you share, for some of my friends that are sex workers, some of the strategies that they use is they make sure that they wait a few hours to post before, so there's no identifiable, whether it be like the sunlight, so you can kind of see the time of day that someone has taken a photo, or any identifiable factors in the background, in order to try and keep themselves safer. Saving evidence of abuse, so things like screenshots or messages in a safe place, particularly if you are someone who is experiencing, supporting someone who's experiencing or have experienced TFGBV, I think is especially important. A support network can also be very helpful. I would recommend reaching out to people that you trust. It can be your family, it can be your found family. I know family relationships can be difficult sometimes. It can be your friends or allies or other people who have experienced similar things. And I think it's reporting harmful behavior when you see it on a platform, acknowledging that that might not always be the best way to have anything happen. Unfortunately, platforms are not often the best at responding. But then also, I think knowing your rights and seeking legal advice if harassment continues to escalate. A really good example of legal remedies, I always point people to the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. This can be really helpful. It was written by a group of women and gender diverse lawyers, which is really cool. And it'll walk you through the differences of things like criminal law, civil litigation, and when or if you should complain to the privacy commissioner. So that's always an option. It's a really excellent resource. Again, for anyone who's looking at this and they're thinking to themselves, why are they sharing resources and there's no links? I promise it's coming. All of them are coming. Another really excellent resource, I love this resource so much, is the BC Society of Transition Houses. This technology safety and privacy kit is incredible. So it works through things like sample logs if you've experienced violence. There's tip sheets for anti-violence workers. There's safety guides if you use an iPhone or if you use an Android, as well as like general web-wise kind of safe web use. It's a really excellent resource. There's a ton of different links. They've created a bunch of resources, and I'll share them all at the end. But I love them so much. I think they're really helpful. For anyone who's interested in learning more, and for context, I am no longer affiliated with the Canadian Women's Foundation, particularly because I did this research on a contract. I think the foundation is incredible. However, during the process of the research report that we were writing, there was also a e-course that was developed as well. So you can learn more about online harm or harassment and abuse, particularly recognizing it and what you can do about it, and it's free. So if anyone is interested in learning more, it's a really, really cool resource. The last thing to think about, as I've been promising all of these, Sarah has shared something significantly more important than I have in the chat. So before I share this link, I will say there is a $25 honorarium for all participants. If you have not left yet, please make sure you click it. It's really important. I will also share another link. Oh my gosh, why isn't that copying? Actually, give me one second. That did a weird thing. Um, let's see. There we go. I've put together a little bit of a technology facilitated gender-based violence resource directory. I'm going to continue to add to it when I find things that I think are helpful and cool. I have a bunch of links that I've saved that just haven't made it here yet, particularly because I moved this from another resource that I had. But I'll continue to update this. Everything that we've discussed today is here. There are yeah, thank you so much. There are other resources that I didn't get a chance to talk about, research reports. If you're someone who works with a nonprofit organization or a grassroots organization and you're like, I want to talk about how technology facilitated gender-based violence impacts my community, there were really cool research reports here that have really great statistics that could potentially help you build a proposal. And I'll also flesh out some peer-reviewed research because embarrassingly enough, I am an academic in my everyday life, but those aren't really those aren't the resources that I find the most interesting. I really like the community grounded ones, but I will build that out as well. So everything that we've discussed here today is here. One other thing that I will share with folks before we end off, I created a little bit of a resource from all of the things that we've talked about today that I'm going to throw in the chat. There are two colors. I will explain the differences. The pink version, which is the first, it says digital in brackets, is a resource that you can just read online on your screen. And then there is also the printable version, which is this black and white version. When you print it, it looks just like this, and you can actually like open it up. I put it on yellow paper. It doesn't take yellow, it's just black and white. But you can open it up and it is perfectly lined up. So like you can see page 1 and page 6. It's gonna be weird if you read the black and white version on your screen because the pages are organized so it prints. But I think this is also a really cool resource for what we talked about today. If you have someone who's maybe not familiar with TFGBV or someone that you think would be interested in learning more or like a center or a resource space that you think would be cool, please feel free to print them out and put them wherever you want. If you want, I can send you some. I think it's a really cool, tangible resource to learn a little bit more about TFGBV, particularly because I think it can impact everyone in various ways. Thank you. Yes, I am a zine nerd, and I'm happy that that worked out. Okay. So I will end off here. I'm going to do something intentional. I'm going to make it sound like this is done. And then we're going to stop recording. So if folks have any questions at the end, they can ask them. So I want to thank everyone who has joined me. If you're interested in getting in touch, I have also included my email here. Please feel free to do so if you want to talk TFGBV, if you want to talk about potential projects, if you want to just be like, that was cool or I have thoughts, please feel free to reach out. I hope you've taken something away from this session. I hope the resources help you out. It's tricky sometimes when people say, sometimes I'll have people say like, I want to read something about TFGBV that's like introductory. And I'm like, okay, about what? Like, do you want to learn about the legal side? Do you want to learn about like the technological side? What are you interested in learning about? So I really hope that that directory is helpful for folks to find cool things. And I will end off and say thank you for joining me. And then if folks have any questions or if there's anything that you're interested in hearing more about, I'm happy to hear about it.